it later when I post it to YouTube or wherever I end up posting things. What's in the culvert there, Brian?
No.
It's can you see it now?
Yeah.
Do you remember that video from last year, the coyote and the badger?
Okay.
Yeah. The folks that don't know, there was a trail camera that caught a coyote leading a badger through a culvert.
That's right.
They cooperate to hunt ground squirrels.
That's incredible. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for sometimes.
Yeah, it's pretty neat, and it raises the importance of animals being able to get across human structures like roads through culverts.
Yep. Okay, it's 12:02. I will continue to admit people, but at this point, I think it's time to get started. Welcome to Lunch with GreenTown. We are in the 4th week of a 5-week series of talks on environmental topics of interest to GreenTown, your local environmental group founded over 10 years ago. As many of you know, we like planting trees, riding bikes, cleaning creeks, and working with kids. Last week, we planted 2 valley oaks at Shout Park with the Los Altos High School Green Team. We have a popular summer internship program, and we take an interest in policy issues and will advocate for the things that we think are important. Take a look at our website for more information and to volunteer for help. We always need volunteers. These talks are 1 hour with time for questions. Please use the chat feature to ask your questions. The talks are being recorded and will be posted later. A big thank you to the Los Altos Parks and Rec Department for helping hosting this series. And another shout out to the Sereno Group. They provided the funds for our outreach with a grant from their 1% for Good Climate and Culture Fund. And now let's begin. Today's talk is by my good friend, Linda Gass. I first worked with Linda in 2011 on her History Museum exhibition, Shaped by Water. That introduced me to both the History Museum and GreenTown. Thank you, Linda. Her talk today will show us that art can change our environmental consciousness. I think you will find it both fascinating and inspiring. Take it away, Linda.
Great. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And it's really great to be here with you all today. And I'm just going to start my slideshow here. So bear with me while I share the screen. Okay, so you see the camping scene?
Yep.
Okay, and now I'm going to hit play. So yeah, so if everybody can make sure they're muted, that would be great. So before I get into my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from my home, which is located in the Adobe Creek watershed. And as we're all painfully aware, we're in the midst of a prolonged drought. So the creek is dry during a time when it should be filled with water. My home is in what is now called Los Altos, a place name that's only around 70 years old. It's important to acknowledge this short history and what a privilege it is to live on the historic land of the Puchan and the unceded ancestral homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone, a place holding a much longer and deeper history, where families have raised children and cared for the land for thousands of years. I recognize that I benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and I express my gratitude and respect for Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, who stewarded this land using a practice of reciprocity throughout the generations. I also want to acknowledge what a great organization GreenTown Los Altos is. It's had a meaningful positive impact on our quality of life in Los Altos. I first got involved with GreenTown in 2008 because I heard that our waste hauling contract was going to be renegotiated, and I wanted the new contract to offer food composting and a smaller garbage can option. And I was really happy to find a group of like-minded people who were on a Green Ribbon Citizens Committee with a fledgling group that was called Cool Cities Los Altos at the time. And we researched the best practices in other cities and toured recycling and waste facilities. And this is a group shot from our tour to the Recology recycling facility with a really impressive tower of paper that's ready to be shipped out for recycling behind us. And you might recognize some familiar faces in this bunch. During the process, we changed our name to GreenTown Los Altos and produced this set of key findings and recommendations that we presented to city staff and the city council, advocating for many of the improvements we see in today's waste contracts, such as a higher landfill diversion rate, rolling carts for paper, glass, and metal recyclables, and the ability to put food waste into the organics bin. And I got my smaller garbage can too. So the title of my talk today is, Can Art Change Our Environmental Consciousness? And it's something I want you to contemplate as I take you behind the scenes into the research and art making processes I use to create my work. I'm going to be showing 4 bodies of work today that all address the intersection of climate change and water. And I looked at 4 different areas: sea level rise, the decreasing snowpack in California. Can you mute yourself, Gary? The damage to our watersheds caused by wildfire, and how we manage our local creeks. My artworks evoke the chaos of climate change through the use of soft, comforting materials and the emotional power of visual storytelling. It's my hope to raise attention and inspire people to change their behavior before it's too late. All of the artworks are very local to San Francisco and the Bay Area, and they are proxies for similar concerns around the world. So next, I want to share some background information. I'm both an environmental activist and an artist, and I combine the two to make artwork about climate change, water, and land use issues in California and the American West. And my approach is to use beauty to encourage people to look at the hard issues we face. I'm inspired by the connections between humans and the water and land we need to survive. I work primarily in textiles, usually painting bird's eye view landscapes on silk, which I then stitch on a sewing machine to add more design and texture. I'm interested in how landscapes change over time, and climate change will have a significant impact, whether it's sea level rise, wildfires, or how much snow falls in our mountains. My artwork begins with an environmental issue, usually related to water. Once I've selected an issue, I do extensive research to learn more about it by doing site visits, reading scientific and historical publications, seeking out historical and present day maps and photographs, and sometimes collaborating with scientists. My research process is integral to developing the concept for my artwork. It helps me refine my choice of subject matter and the composition for my work. As general research, I spend a lot of time during the summer seeking out the headwaters of the streams and rivers that we rely on for survival. And they're always located in the most beautiful places I've ever seen. The wilderness is also where I go to find magic and refresh my perspective on life. It's vast and unforgiving, and it reminds me of my place in the universe. You can only reach these headwaters by foot, and it usually takes several days to get there. So I do a lot of backpacking with my life partner, Rob. And climate change is now impacting our backpacking trips, with frequent, intense wildfires becoming one of the additional challenges we face when in the backcountry. This photo was taken in July 2018 while hiking on the Pacific Crest Trail east of Redding, California. We saw smoke and an ominous pyrocumulonimbus cloud from our campsite. 2 days later, this was the air we woke up to. Visibility was about 200 feet, and the air was seriously unhealthy to breathe. After that summer, I started carrying an emergency N95 respirator mask in my backpack. And who knew that this would become a scarce and essential item for both COVID and local wildfires? I'm not exactly sure how I got interested in water issues, but I think the concept entered my mind subconsciously because of growing up in Los Angeles. This is me playing in the sand on the beach in Santa Monica. My mom's from Luxembourg, a tiny European country where it rains a lot. And she tried to raise my sisters and me with the superstitions of her childhood. So every night we had salad with dinner, and because salad doesn't keep very well, we were told that if we didn't finish the salad, it would rain the next day. Well, everyone in Los Angeles knows that it hardly ever rains in LA, so we couldn't take her threat very seriously. But that planted a nagging question in my mind because I was surrounded by swimming pools, palm trees, lush lawns, and golf courses that needed a lot of water, and it never rained. So where did the water come from? Something didn't make sense. And then one day I learned that Los Angeles is really a desert, and it imports lots of water from far away to make it look green. And I haven't been able to let go of that since. The first series of artwork I'm going to talk about is entitled Urban Power versus San Lorenzo Creek, What's Next? These three artworks show how we've modified our local urban streams and question the implications of that for dealing with climate change in California and groundwater storage. The artwork is based on San Lorenzo Creek in the town of San Lorenzo in the East Bay, and I've highlighted that town here in red. And this is what San Lorenzo Creek looks like today. The creek channel is completely encased in concrete. Historically, the creek was a source of groundwater recharge. Water from this creek would seep through the gravel stream bed into the aquifer below. I researched historical maps, aerial photographs, and satellite images for the three time periods I wanted to focus on. In order to see what the creek originally looked like, I found this map of the San Francisco Bay Area from 1873. Now I'm going to zoom in onto where San Lorenzo is, and I'm going to highlight the San Lorenzo Creek for you so you can see what the original meandering creek looked like. And here's an enlargement of the section of the creek that I decided to focus on from that 1873 map. The next time period I was interested in was post-World War II, when the area made the transition from agriculture to suburbs. I found this aerial photograph of San Lorenzo from the year 1946 in the US Geological Survey archives, and it reveals a lot about what happened to the creek. I want to orient this photograph to be the same as the orientation on the 1873 map, and I'll highlight the same section of creek that I'm focusing on in the artwork. And here's an enlargement of the photograph just focusing on that section of the creek. The creek still meanders, but not quite as much as before. The farmers straightened it out somewhat to make it easier to work their fields. But the creek hadn't yet been encased in concrete, which allowed it to flood over the farmlands during heavy rains, which was actually a welcomed event by the farmers since it spread nutrients all over the soil. One thing I want you to notice, though, is the suburban development in the lower left. As you might imagine, those houses did not welcome the creek flooding over, which is what led to the concrete flood channel being built from 1954 to 1961. Finally, I wanted to understand what the creek looks like today from the bird's eye point of view, so I used Google Earth to get a satellite image of the area. And here I've highlighted the same section of creek, and you can see how much straighter the creek is. And here's an enlarged view of that section of the creek. You can see how all the farm fields have been converted to suburbs. So putting all three sections together, here's the 1873 map, the 1946 aerial photograph, and the satellite image from 2019. You can really see how much the creek was modified over the past 2 centuries. I chose to orient the work vertically, so I'm going to reorient these. And now I'm going to show you the process of creating the artwork. I first created drawings based on my research, and then I made small watercolors to come up with a color scheme for the artwork. Here I'd like to point out that I didn't have any photographs to inform what the landscape around the creek looked like in 1873, but luckily I found a paper published by the San Francisco Estuary Institute about the historical ecology of San Lorenzo Creek while I was doing my research. They translated journals from Spanish explorers and missionaries to piece together a landscape of willows and oak savanna, and I recreated a view of the landscape from the bird's eye point of view based on those descriptions. I then enlarged my smaller drawings to actual size using pencil, and then I trace over it with a Sharpie marker to prepare it for tracing onto the silk. In order to paint on the silk, I need to stretch it on a wooden frame to create a taut surface. Otherwise, the dyes would run everywhere. I then trace the drawing onto the stretched silk using a special pencil that stays on the silk long enough for me to make my painting, but eventually washes out. I use liquid transparent silk dyes, and I mix all of my colors from the primary cyan, magenta, and yellow. I use black for darker shades, and if I want lighter shades, I dilute it with water. This is a dye mixing chart I made using the primary colors. This is this way, like when I want to mix a color, the chart helps me figure out the proportions of the primary colors that I need to use. And silk painting is similar to watercolor painting. You paint the colors from light to dark. Because the dyes are transparent, a lighter color simply won't show up on top of a darker one. So I have to strategically plan how I'm going to apply my colors to my paintings. These are my brushes. Most are regular watercolor brushes. But in the lower right corner are special Japanese brushes I use for blending colors together into a smooth gradation. Here's my current studio in San Jose at the Alameda Artworks, where I make my textile artwork. And you can see the bottles of dyes and other tools stored in the wire shelves behind me. The silk dyes bleed into the fabric, similar to what happens if an ink pen leaks on a shirt. It just keeps spreading and spreading. So I use a resist to create boundaries for the dyes. The resist is similar in consistency to white glue, and I apply it from a squeeze bottle with a really fine tip. And when it dries, it acts as a barrier to contain the dye. So I build up multiple layers of dye and resist to create my final painting. So here I first painted a thin line of yellow dye, and now I'm applying resist to that. Once the resist dries, I test for leaks by painting on water. If there is a leak, the water is clear and it won't ruin the painting. And here you can see a leak. Yep, right there. And there's one other one. Yeah, right there. So after I've repaired the leaks and tested them again, I start applying the dyes. And so this is a time lapse of me painting the creek with different colors of blue dye. And you can see how the resist is acting as a barrier to contain the dyes. And this is more time lapse of me painting the landforms and vegetation around the creek. I let the dye dry in between applications, and sometimes I apply it wet. In this case, I'm applying wet dye to the wet surface so that it blends more. But here, I've let it dry and I'm applying the dye to the dry surface. So when I'm done with the painting, I make a sandwich with a white silk backing on the bottom, and then a layer of fluffy material called batting. And then I put my silk painting on top. And in preparation for sewing, I baste the layers together using very small safety pins. The pins leave permanent holes in the silk, so I strategically place them in areas where I know I will stitch them with my sewing machine. Then I stitch the painting on my sewing machine using colored embroidery thread to create a highly textured sculptural landscape. I use a capability that exists on all sewing machines called the free motion embroidery or darning feature, where I guide the fabric under the needle instead of letting the machine guide the fabric. And here are the finished artworks. The title of the artwork is Urban Power versus San Lorenzo Creek, What's Next? To raise the question that now that we've contained all our creeks in concrete and they can no longer recharge our groundwater, what changes do we need to make to manage our groundwater and creeks more wisely in the future to support a growing population in the face of climate change? So in 2014, I created this artwork that examines the consequences of climate change and the past policy of suppressing forest fires. But this work isn't only about wildfire, it's about water as well. It highlights the impact that the Rim Fire had on the Tuolumne River watershed that 2.4 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area rely on for their drinking water. In the Pacific Northwest, they have rainforests. And here in the Sierra, we have fire forests. Fire is a natural part of the life cycle of healthy forest ecosystems. And many species actually rely on fire for survival, like this giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park. It's common to see burn scars like this on living trees. And this is what a healthy wildfire looks like. It's burning low to the ground, burning fallen old trees and dry underbrush, and clearing out thick growth to allow sunlight to reach younger trees. For over a century, though, we thought we were saving forests by not allowing them to burn. In the words of Dr. Mark Finney of the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, we've taken an ecosystem that was sustained by fire and turned it into one that is destroyed by fire. Unfortunately, if you combine drought, high air temperatures, and an abundance of fuel from decades of fire suppression, you get a mega fire like the Rim Fire that burned so hot and fast it consumed entire trees. The fire was started by hunters' illegal campfire near the rim of the world Vista Point on August 17, 2013, during the hottest part of the summer and 2 years into a significant drought. This photograph was taken on August 22nd, 5 days after the Rim Fire began. I was on a bus to Yosemite Valley to begin a backpacking trip on the John Muir Trail, and it was the first time I ever saw a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. These clouds are formed by intense heating of the air from a very hot wildfire. As the hot air rises, it cools and it condenses the moisture in the air into this cloud formation. But pyrocumulonimbus clouds look distinctly different from cumulonimbus clouds. They look like the aftermath of an explosion because they've got all the smoke in them as well. This map shows how quickly the fire grew. It expanded to nearly 400 square miles in just over 7 days. It took more than 2 months to fully contain it. And until last year, it was the largest recorded wildfire in the Sierra, but now the Creek Fire overtook it. This shaded map shows the area of the entire Tuolumne River watershed. The Rim Fire is outlined in red, and you can see that 96% of the fire was in the watershed of the Tuolumne River. There are long-term impacts of this fire. Water quality has been affected by ash, fire retardant, and soil erosion. And some of the severely burned areas may never recover to forests, which will change the character of the watershed forever. So this map shows how much vegetation was burned within the Rim Fire boundary. Red represents the most severely burned areas and accounts for almost 40% of the total area. Many of the red areas are directly adjacent to the Tuolumne River and its tributaries. And this is what a severely burned area looked like 2 months after the fire started. There's nothing green left. In my concept for the artwork, I wanted to focus on the areas that were severely burned. So I began by tracing areas on the vegetation burn severity map that were red. Here you can see the completed tracing still on top of the colored map. And then this is the final result. So my idea was to use the language of maps to show how much of the watershed had been severely burned. My next step was to tile together the 7.5-minute topographic maps for the region, which is what I've done in this image. I then placed a greatly enlarged version of the tracing I did of the severely burned areas over the topo maps, and then traced the topographic lines only in the areas that were severely burned, under the rationale that now that the vegetation is completely gone, you can clearly see the topography. So this is a close-up of the drawing for a small portion of the final artwork. And you can see the topo lines I traced within the boundary of one of the severely burned areas. And then I transferred my drawings onto black silk and stitched them on the sewing machine using blue thread for the Tuolumne River and its tributaries, and light gray thread for the topographic lines. The boundary of the fire is shown by the dashed stitched line, and the burned areas that weren't severely burned are stitched with meandering stitches in black thread to create a chaotic looking surface. And then the areas outside of the fire boundary are represented by orderly grid lines. So here's the entire artwork where the affected watershed's been divided up into 12 squares. And the blue thread of the rivers and reservoirs really comes alive against the black silk. And you can see the abundance of light gray topographic lines and just highlighting just how much of the landscape was reduced to ash. 1 year after the fire, I revisited some of the severely burned areas. Many of the burned trees in the national forest were logged in what was called a salvage logging effort to harvest the wood for timber. While this brought a nice temporary economic boost to the logging companies and local communities, it robbed the local forest of the ecosystem benefits of the deadwood's role in regenerating the forest for future generations. But I was encouraged to see a variety of new saplings growing up from the charred landscape. So I want to go back to this view of the burned forest, because if you look near the center of this photo really carefully, there's a surprise. I know it's hard to see, so I'll circle it here. So while visiting this logged area, I stumbled upon this random piece of art in the logged forest. I have no idea who made it, and I'd love to know if there's any particular significance to this chairback, but it was a real surprise and delight to see. So I'd like to go back to this photo of the burned area from 2014 one more time to show you some rephotography I did in 2019. So this is the same area 5 years later. Sadly, the chair is gone. However, the forest is starting to grow back, but you can see how long it will be before it looks like anything like the kind of forest that it was. Next, I'm going to show you an artwork about one of the most visible effects of climate change, sea level rise. I made this triptych for a recent solo exhibition at the Museum of Craft and Design, which is located in the Dogpatch neighborhood of San Francisco. The director of the museum asked me if I could make a work that would show how sea level rise could affect the museum, and this was the resulting artwork. Sea level rise is caused by two factors. One obvious one, the melting of land ice as the earth warms, and the second one is less obvious, but has just as much impact. As the ocean warms, it expands in volume. So already sea level has risen by 7 to 8 inches since 1900. And this rate has increased in the recent decades to about 1/8 of an inch per year. We can see the effects of this rise during high tide events in the winter called king tides, as shown in this photograph, where the water in San Francisco Bay is flowing over the seawalls. One of my favorite resources for understanding sea level rise is published on the website of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, referred to as NOAA. Their sea level rise viewer shows the effect of rising sea levels on any place in the United States. When the Trump administration started removing climate change publications from government websites, I became alarmed that I might lose this resource, so I took screenshots just in case it disappeared. Thankfully, it never did. So I'm going to walk you through the screenshots I took for San Francisco, showing 1 to 10 feet of sea level rise. You can see that the impact of sea level rise is subtle until we reach a level of 3 feet, and that starts impacting San Francisco on the eastern side. At 5 feet, you start seeing significant impact in other parts of the city, and the eastern side is even more impacted. It became clear to me that the areas of San Francisco around the Dogpatch neighborhood are going to be the hardest hit by sea level rise. And it felt appropriate to focus on that, since it's also where the Museum of Craft and Design is located. I'm now going to zoom in on the Dogpatch area and repeat the sea level rise sequence so you can get a more intimate sense of what happens. I've highlighted where the museum is located in magenta. Although the museum is spared from sea level rise, much of the surrounding neighborhood is not. So for the final installation, I chose to make a series of 3 artworks, one showing the present day sea level and the other 2 showing 3 and 6 feet of sea level rise. I chose these amounts based on the scientific projections released in 2018 by the California Ocean Protection Council, a state-appointed science and policy advisory team. Projections for 2050 show a modest increase of 1 foot. However, by 2100, the likely projections are between 3 and 6 feet. And these are the 2 alternatives I chose to convey in the artwork. If carbon emissions fall significantly, we'll only have 3 feet of rise. But if they continue at current levels, we'll have 6 feet. Now I'll share some of the process I used to make this series of 3 artworks. Because the cityscape was identical in all 3 artworks, I decided to make one silk painting for the base cityscape and then try a technique that was new to me by scanning the original painting, modifying it in Photoshop for 3 feet and then 6 feet, and then printing the 3 artworks digitally on silk before stitching them. So here I'm showing some of the steps in creating the base silk painting, where I build up layers of resist and dye, working from light to dark. And these are a series of photographs I took over a period of 2 weeks of my progress on the silk painting. And you can see how I build up the different layers of dye and resist. When I finished the painting, I had it scanned with a high resolution scanner, and then I used Adobe Photoshop to modify that image to show 3 and 6 feet of sea level rise by adding a transparent blue layer to show where the flooding occurs. Also, with sea level rise, the depth of the bay increases, so I wanted to make the bay water a darker shade. So for starters, I'm going to walk you through how I shaded the bay water to be darker, like this. Okay, so back to the original artwork so I can show you a quick Photoshop demo of how I did this. First, I create a gradient layer from a lighter blue to a darker blue. Then I tell Photoshop to multiply it with the original layer of artwork beneath it. And then I reduce the opacity of that blue gradient layer to 60%. Now I'm going to show you how I created a mask so that the blue gradient layer only darkens the bay water and not the whole cityscape. So back to the original artwork, I'm going to zoom in to work on it and scroll down to an area of the design that's easier to work on. I put the transparent blue gradient layer back on top, and now I'm going to make a mask so that the cityscape won't be shaded. The orange areas that you see are the mask, and I'm using different brush sizes to mask over the cityscape area. Now I'm going to hide the orange masking so you can see the effect of the mask. See how the original cityscape painting is bright again? So now I'm going to get rid of this demonstration layer I've been working on and just go back to the original artwork. In the interest of time, I'm showing you the final masked blue layer there. Next, I want to show you how I created the transparent flooded areas on top of the cityscape. I began by importing a screenshot of the NOAA sea level rise map for 6 feet of flooding. It's not the same size as my artwork, so I need to scale it up. To make it easy to align with my artwork, I make it slightly transparent, and then I start scaling it up until it lines up. Next, I make it opaque again so I can paint a layer mask using it as a guideline. But in the interest of time, rather than doing the demo in Photoshop, I'm just going to show you the resulting mask layer of transparent blue. And then I turn off the NOAA screenshot layer to reveal the final artwork with both the gradient applied to the bay water and the transparent blue areas on the cityscape. So once again, here's the artwork without the flooded areas on the cityscape, and here's the final artwork again. So I created these 3 digital files in preparation for printing on silk on a large format digital printer. And here's one of the Photoshop images being printed on paper-backed pre-treated silk. The pre-treatment bonds the printer inks to the silk, and the paper backing makes it possible to run the silk through the printer. I'm going to share a few videos of the work I did stitching the artwork. When I'm stitching long straight lines, I like to use the walking foot on my sewing machine as it keeps the multiple layers from moving around too much. So this is a slow motion video of how the walking foot works, which I think is really mesmerizing to watch. And this is a time lapse of how I stitch the parallel lines in the pavement areas of the cityscape using a free motion embroidery foot and guiding the fabric under the needle. And here's some real-time video of me stitching one of the grass areas. After I'm done with all the stitching, I hem the artwork by hand before I mount it onto frames. And here's the final stitched artwork. The last artwork I'm going to talk about today is entitled "Someday There May Be No More Snow," and it's about the decrease in the Sierra snowpack during my lifetime. Historically, the mountain snowpack has served as California's largest water storage, and the state's entire system of dams and reservoirs was designed with this in mind. In spring, the snowpack starts melting and slowly releases water through the summer to replenish the reservoirs. But climate change is causing warmer air temperatures in the winter, which is reducing the snowpack because more of the moisture is falling as rain instead of snow, which results in less water during the summer months. The California Department of Water Resources carefully keeps track of snow measurements at different locations throughout the higher elevations of the state, which they call snow courses, and I've shown them as dots on this map. Snow survey personnel go to the snow courses on a monthly basis during the winter to measure the snow water equivalent of the snowpack using a special snow coring tube. This photograph happened to be taken on the 1st of April, which is an important date for water resource managers, because that's when the snowpack is considered to be at its peak. The extracted core samples are then weighed to determine the snow water equivalent. Once the snow core is weighed, it's converted to inches of snow water equivalent, where each ounce of weight represents an inch. In order to make the artwork, I needed accurate data. And I found raw data for the water content in the snowpack in a database from the California Department of Water Resources, but there were gaps in the data and I wasn't sure how to calculate a statewide average accurately. So I reached out to a local weather guru who connected me with a team of climatologists from the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno. And they analyzed the raw data and gave me this spreadsheet with the year, the April 1st snow water equivalent, and the difference from the average. So now I'm going to walk you through my process of what I did with the data and how I experimented with different ways to present it in the most visually compelling way. So I began with a standard column graph. This graph clearly shows the wild fluctuations in snowpack in California, and I show the average line across there in red. And we have very few normal years. For as long as humans have been keeping track, flood and drought have been the norm in California. However, this chart didn't convey the decrease in a visually obvious way. So my next idea was to color code the columns, blue for above average years and brown for below, to see if it would make the trend more visible. But once again, the graph emphasized the fluctuations, but didn't really convey an obvious decline. So next, I tried a chart showing the difference from the average as negative and positive values, also color-coded. This conveyed the trend, especially in the last decade, with 5 years of severe drought. And although there were a couple of bountiful above average years, they're not nearly as impressive as the earlier decades. So I've added these red arrows to emphasize that downward trend that I see in this data. I further modified the design by coloring the columns with a gradation from white to either blue or brown to make it easier to compare years that aren't adjacent to one another. And this is the actual artwork that I made from the data. And I wanted this artwork to have a fragile quality. So I chose to make it out of thread lace. And I chose a curved shape for the columns to evoke the shape of the snow coring tube. So now I'm going to show you the process of making it. The lace is made by stitching a network of threads on a dissolvable embroidery stabilizer. So here I am stitching spirals that are symbolic of water for the blue above average columns. To ensure the lace holds together after the stabilizer is dissolved, I had to make sure the thread stitches overlapped and interlocked in a grid-like manner. So here I am stitching wavy lines symbolic of dry earth for the brown below average columns. All of the designs are guided by my hands. They're not programmed into the sewing machine. And I change thread colors to create the gradation. Once the stitching is done, the stabilizer is removed by dissolving it in water, leaving only thread lace. It takes about 10 minutes for the stabilizer to fully dissolve. And then you can see how the interlocking network of threads creates a really strong lace that keeps its shape. So how did I turn the thread lace panels into rigid curved shapes? I used a fabric stiffener called Paverpol. I applied it with gloved hands and then massage it into the thread lace. And you want to apply just the right amount, not so much that you end up clogging the holes in the lace, but enough so that you can stiffen the lace so it'll hold its shape. So once the whole piece of lace is covered with fabric stiffener, I form it on a tube, an acrylic tube that approximates the size of the snow coring tubes that I've wrapped freezer paper around so that I can easily remove the stiffened lace when I'm done. And I let it dry, and once it's dry, it holds its shape. So the next problem we solved is how do you attach these thread lace columns to the wall so that the hanging mechanism doesn't show? So here's how I chose to solve it. To use tiny, super strong neodymium magnets. I've included a penny for scale so you can see how tiny they are, and magnetic nails. Paint the nails to match the wall color. Glue the magnets to the thread lace, and then hammer the nails into the wall, and the magnets hold the thread lace to the nails. The next problem to be solved: how do you consistently hammer the nails into the wall at a precise location, exactly perpendicular to the wall, and the nail has to stick out exactly 1¼ inches? Well, I decided to create a wood block guide that's 1¼ inches thick with a groove just wide enough for the nails. And that let me get the nails in perpendicular at the right depth at precisely the right location. So here I am installing the artwork at the museum using the guide that I created. And here are all 132 nails hammered into the wall. And I actually really like this on its own. It's given me ideas for future artwork. And the moment of truth came when I had to attach each thread lace column, praying that I precisely glued the magnets and put the nails in place so that they lined up exactly, and thankfully they did. And on a final note, I take the same care in creating packaging for my artwork as I do in creating the artwork itself. The delicate thread lace columns needed to be transported and they could not arrive bent out of shape. So this is one of the 4 boxes that hold the 60 thread lace columns. And one final view of the artwork again. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. And if you're interested, you can see more of my work in 2 virtual exhibitions that are listed here. I also list updates on my website. You can follow me on social media where I post photographs and video about what I'm up to. So if you want to see my current projects, if you like the video footage and photographs you saw today, there's more on social media. And one more thing I'll mention is I'm collaborating with a mural artist, Morgan Bricca, to create 2 murals for the new community center in Los Altos. And we'll be presenting the preliminary design for the murals to the Public Arts Commission next Thursday, March 25th at 6:15 p.m. And you're welcome to join the virtual meeting to hear my presentation about the research I did and the artwork that I designed from that research. So thank you so much for being here today. And now it's time for you to ask questions. I don't know about answers, but I'm always happy to hear your questions. And I'll put up the question I asked at the title of my talk. What do you think? Can art change our environmental consciousness? So I'll stop my share here.
Linda, that was amazing. I knew it would be, but not only are you a talented artist, you have amazing patience.
Only with art.
No, that's incredible. I guess in terms of our environmental consciousness, we do think about, thanks to you, these different issues. And I can see that fortunately forests do recover slowly. I'm not sure what to do about creeks that have been channelized and now are surrounded by urban development. That's probably a more difficult challenge. Maybe Brian can weigh in on that one. The snowpack and the sea level rise. I guess you can build a lot of dikes, but that's expensive. What are they going to do in Holland? I have no idea. Anyway, if anybody does have a question, you can go to the chat box, or actually, this is we're a friendly group. If you want to just unmute yourself and ask, I think that might work as well.
Yeah, I'd love for people to unmute themselves and ask. That'd be great.
And enable your videos too, so we see people instead of names. That'd be fun. Well, I will say one thing. There's the new exhibit that's at the History Museum right now, Beauty and the Beast, is certainly worth a visit. It's amazing photography of wildflowers throughout the state of California, and that's the beauty. And then the beast is the climate change and what it's doing to flowers and everything else. And there are some panels that the photographers have installed that give you some ideas on what we can do to help mitigate climate change. So it leaves with a somewhat hopeful note.
Hey, Gary, this is Pat Marriott. I have a question for Linda.
Yes, please.
Hey, Linda, how long do you ever trace how long it takes you to do some of these amazing pieces? For example, that China Basin, if you added up all the hours of research and then all the hours of actually working on the art, what would that amount to?
So I've actually started using a time tracker now. And so I do my best to try to track my time on my projects. I don't think I tracked my research time because I think I'd done that research before I started using the time tracker, but I know how many hours went into stitching the artwork, which was 148. Well, I think it was 168, but yeah, it's a lot of time. And it takes, so on average, it will take me 2 weeks to a month to do a silk painting. And then depending on the size of the stitched painting, it can take me up to 2 months to stitch it because, 168 hours, I can't sit there 8 hours a day doing it. So I have to break that time up. So
Yeah. It is a very time-consuming process to create things. I know when I worked with Linda in 2011 on Shape by Water, that was her show. Thank you. You were the creative genius on that one. It was a year-long process. It's what it takes.
and there was a great team involved in that who came together, and there's several people here who helped with that, like Judy Eichler, who did the graphic design, incredible panels for it, and picked beautiful blue wall color for the exhibition.
Yeah. Judy's still very helpful with it.
And Barbara and Kevin
yeah,
did all kinds of great research.
and all those rocks they brought.
Yes.
Thanks, Linda.
I have a question for Linda.
Please. Go ahead.
Linda, I found you on social media a while back, and I've been following your work, and I really appreciate how you use all this environmental data in your art pieces. And I'm just curious if your background has anything to do with sciences, if you studied science as well as art.
That's a great question. And usually in a presentation, I do create a little section about my background, but because I wanted to leave enough time for questions, I cut that out. But yes, so I've been making art all of my life, and I love art, and I wanted to study it in college, but I am the daughter of immigrant parents who saved their money up for my college education. And so they had a say so in what I majored in. And they said that I'd better get a degree that I could earn a living with. And I was good at math. And so I ended up with a bachelor's degree in mathematical sciences and then a master's degree in computer science. And while I was doing my master's, I sought to combine art and computer science as much as I could, and ended up after college going to work for a tiny startup at a time when it was not a thing to join a startup. In fact, my advisor thought I was nuts. He was like, "You're going to be out of a job in a year." And I thought, I'm 23. Who cares if I'm out of a job in a year? I'll get another one. And that company was Adobe Systems. So, which turned out to be an absolutely incredible experience. But yes, so my background is engineering science based. And I like working with numbers and precision and all those things. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
So Linda, now that our environmental awareness has been raised, I will say to the people who live in Los Altos, at least, this is an important year. We're going to be evaluating our climate action plan and coming up with CAP 2.0. And so pay attention to that. Give the council your input, the Environmental Commission, and let's see if we can do a really good job with that one.
Any more questions?
Brian, you're going to tell us about creeks?
I'm happy to. I see Barb has a question.
Yeah, I saw Barb.
This is the best hour I've spent in such a long time, and I want to share it with, everybody I know. How it's maybe pressure on you, Gary. You've got so many things on the computer for us to see. Is there a way to tell friends how to see this?
Well, they're all recorded, and as soon as I figure out how to get it onto YouTube, it'll happen. Maybe this weekend. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay.
So I was thinking about Linda's questions about how art can raise environmental consciousness in the context of creeks. And I wonder if celebration of restoration is one way that could happen. So for example, Linda's presentation on San Lorenzo Creek was talking about how it's been separated from the water table for flood protection purposes. And one thing you can do that is a compromise is maybe you're not removing the sidewalls, but you can remove the bottom wall, the bottom of the cement bottom surface, and then you've reconnected the creek to the water table. So I don't know if there's a good way to depict that, but that's something where I'd look to somebody, an artist, to depict that. And
Yeah.
just to add that you look at LA River and some really amazing things they've done there, where they're restoring it in bits and pieces. That might be something where an artist can really convey some of the interesting things that are happening.
Yeah, those are nice suggestions, Brian. So I don't know about the engineering aspect of removing the creek bottom but leaving the side channel walls, whether or not it would cause erosion underneath the walls. I don't know how that can be done, but what's moving forward now in a lot of communities is low impact development, where a lot of our stormwater gets channeled to the creeks and then rushed out to the bay. And instead of capturing rainwater where it falls and having it soak into the ground using low impact development, so on streets, having curb cuts that go into rain gardens that are planted along the gutters of the streets, seems to be a really popular way to approach this now. And then there are already projects happening where sections of creek are being restored in areas where the flooding concern isn't as great, where they've removed the concrete channelization and actually made or sometimes actually daylighted the creek. A lot of the creeks run through pipes where we can't even see them, which is the case for a bunch of the creeks in Los Altos. And like Permanente Creek disappears into a underground tube, and so does Hale Creek. So, but now there are efforts to daylight those into actual riparian corridors, which then are good for wildlife and pollinators and all kinds of good stuff. So,
yeah, good thoughts, Linda. Appreciate that. And the stormwater capture really does work. There's a little street near me, Rosita, and the water that comes down one side is normal pavement, and it runs straight to the storm drain. On the other side, they've put in the curb cuts and some stormwater capture basins, and no water goes to the storm drain during a normal rain. It really does work. Any other questions, comments? Tara?
Hi, Linda, thank you for an amazing talk. I've been following your work for a while. It's amazing.
I've been following yours too. It's nice to see you in person.
I wanted to know more about GreenTown, and I live in Menlo Park, and my studio's in Palo Alto. And are there organizations aligned with you guys in those areas, or?
Well, in Menlo Park, there is Menlo Spark.
Menlo Spark, okay.
Yes, we check them out. They're a very active group, a good group.
Yeah, I want to do a project with plastics that I'd love the community to get involved with.
Oh yeah.
So
Linda did some nice artwork with a piece of plastic. the surfboard.
Oh, that was Barbara and Kevin who found that artwork that was done by a surfer artist, Kathleen Egan. So she made a wave out of plastic bottles and put it around a surfboard. So it was one of the installations at the Shape by Water exhibition.
It was fun. Kids would get up on that, well, adults too, and ride the wave.
No, the name of that was Barreled by Plastic.
Okay.
well, thank you for that. I'll check out Menlo Spark.
Yeah, another organization that you might want to contact is Acterra.
How do you spell
They're
that?
ACTERRA.
Uh-huh.
And they might be able to connect you with some resources related to that, and also just promote what you're doing if it sounds community-based. So
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, getting back to the History Museum's Beauty and the Beast, the two photographers are going to give a presentation this coming Thursday on how they do their photography and their 27-year journey doing this. And that'll be Thursday at 5 o'clock. You can go to the History Museum website and sign up.
Isn't it tonight?
Tonight.
No, it's Thursday.
We are Thursday.
It's Thursday.
Oh, it's next Thursday.
It's on the 25th. I thought it was the 18th.
It's tonight.
Overwhelming.
Well, at least I got your attention.
Good thing I'm your co-host here.
Good thing. Okay. Well,
So I thought Judy maybe had her hand raised. I don't know. Did you want to ask something? No. Okay. Sorry.
it is close to the hour. Let me just mention that next week we'll have our final talks. And here I do have the dates right. Tuesday, Julie Noblet will talk about the future of water. And although it is rainy right now, it appears that we're heading into another drought year. I'll be sending the Zoom link later today for that one. And then on Thursday, we will have Master Gardeners Lisa and Kathleen Putnam getting in the last word with some practical gardening advice. So I hope to see you next week for both of those.
Also, can I give my answer to can art change our environmental consciousness?
Please.
Okay. So I think that art has the power to touch people emotionally in ways that scientific data doesn't. And I translate scientific data and facts into art, and I try to make that art beautiful to draw people in to look at these hard environmental issues that we're facing. And I'm also able to address audiences that scientists may not reach, because I get the unsuspecting audience who walks into a museum or a gallery or a community space where my artwork is. I've also been out in the community and done community engaged artworks. And so I feel like it really does have that power. And I get a lot of appreciation from scientists with respect to the way that I've conveyed the projects that they've been working on, like especially with bay restoration. So I feel like it does have that power. And I encourage others to make their own art around this. So
Yeah, it's a good way to, that is important.
yeah.
So different people hear things differently, and it's important to have it from all aspects.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for being here. It's really
Indeed.
nice to be able to share this with you.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. We so appreciate it. Thank
Yeah,
you. And thanks
great.
everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.